I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into the boarding house. It wasn't the air, though it felt heavier than it should have been. It wasn't the lighting, though the dim yellow bulbs flickered as if struggling to stay awake. It wasn't even the silence, though it was the kind that pressed against my ears, thick and expectant. No, it was something else, something deeper, something unseen. An unsettling sensation crawled under my skin, cold and unshakable, like the walls themselves were watching, whispering in a language I couldn't hear. I had walked into a place that didn't want me there. The landlady, Mrs. Carter, stood behind the counter, her frail hands folded neatly in front of her. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, as though time had carved its story into her skin. Her gray eyes, dull, unreadable, rested on me in a way that made my stomach tighten. She said nothing at first, just reached under the counter and handed me a small brass key, along with a neatly folded piece of paper. Her fingers lingered on the edges of the paper as I took it from her. "Read this carefully," she said, her voice quiet, measured. "And follow every rule." There was no warmth in her words, no unnecessary pleasantries. Just a warning wrapped in a simple instruction. I hesitated, glancing toward the wall near the entrance. A faded list of rules was taped there, its edges curling with age, the ink smudged and uneven. I barely glanced at it, assuming it was the usual: no smoking, no loud music, no guests after 10 p.m. I should have paid more attention. I should have stopped and read every word. Instead, I unfolded the paper in my hands, and as my eyes scanned the list, my stomach twisted into a tight knot. Boarding house rules. Rule 1. Lock your door before midnight. Do not open it for anyone until sunrise. Rule 2. If you hear knocking past midnight, ignore it. No matter who they claim to be, they are not real. Rule 3. Always greet the old man in room 7 if you see him in the hallway. If he doesn't greet you back, hide in the nearest room immediately. Rule 4. Do not eat food left outside your door. No one in this house leaves food for others. Rule 5. If you wake up and feel someone watching you, do not move. Do not speak. Close your eyes until morning. Rule 6. If you hear the landlady humming past midnight, do not look out of your window. Do not let her know you are awake. My hands tightened around the paper, the words blurring slightly as I reread them. My mouth felt dry. "This isn't a joke, is it?" I asked, my voice quieter than I had intended. Mrs. Carter didn't answer immediately. She only studied me, her expression blank, before shaking her head, once. "Follow the rules, you'll be fine," she repeated. And just like that, she turned and walked away, her slow, deliberate steps echoing down the hallway. I stood there, my heart hammering. The paper felt heavier in my hands now. My mind told me it was ridiculous. Some weird tradition or an old superstition meant to scare new tenants. But deep down, somewhere in the part of my brain that still clung to instinct, I knew I had just made a terrible mistake by moving in. I went to my room. It was small but clean. A bed, a wooden desk, a single chair near the window. The walls were a dull beige, bare except for a single painting of a forest that looked too dark, too deep. I ran a hand along the desk surface. Dust-free. Everything was strangely spotless, as if no one had truly lived here before. The walls were thin. I could hear faint shuffling, the quiet murmurs of my neighbors settling in for the night. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the hallway. I swallowed hard and double-checked my door, twisting the lock with a sharp click. Then, I climbed into bed, the folded paper resting on the nightstand beside me. The rules ran through my mind like a looping whisper. I wasn't sure how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling. At some point, my eyelids grew heavy. Sleep crept in. The silence of the room wrapped around me like a thick fog. And then, I heard something. A knock. Again and again. My eyes snapped open. A cold wave of fear crashed through me. A voice followed. "Hey, man, it's Adam. My key isn't working. Can you open up?" Adam. My next-door neighbor. I had met him earlier, friendly, talkative, the kind of guy who could make any place feel normal. He had been here for 3 months. He had smiled when he introduced himself. He had seemed real. But the second rule echoed in my mind. If you hear knocking past midnight, ignore it. No matter who they claim to be, they are not real. I gripped the blanket, my breath shallow. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs. Knock. 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 Adam's voice again. This time, there was a slight edge to it. "Oh, come on. I just need you to open the door for a second. Please." I almost answered. Almost. But something was wrong. His voice, it sounded close. Too close, like he was whispering right against the wood. And yet, there was something else. A flatness. A hollowness. Like an imitation of a voice, someone trying to sound like Adam but failing in the smallest, most unnatural ways. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay silent. The knocking stopped. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. For the rest of the night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. The next morning, I stepped into the hallway, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing on me. I hadn't slept. Not really. Every creak of the floor, every distant sound in the walls, every whisper of wind outside had kept me frozen beneath my blanket. Listening. Waiting for something I couldn't see. When morning finally came, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a temporary escape, like something was letting me go, just for a little while. The hallway was quiet, bathed in dull gray light filtering in from a small, dust-covered window at the end of the corridor. I turned toward the kitchen, the thought of coffee, the only thing keeping me upright. And then, I saw him. The old man from room 7. He stood completely still in the middle of the hallway. His frail frame wrapped in a tattered, oversized sweater that hung off his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too thin over sharp cheekbones. His lips were cracked, and his eyes, dark, sunken, hollow. They stared at me, unblinking. The air shifted. A chill ran up my spine, sharp and immediate. I forced myself to speak. "Good morning." The words felt small, insignificant, against the weight of the silence between us. He didn't respond. My throat tightened. Always greet the old man in room 7. If he doesn't greet you back, hide immediately. Third rule flashed in my mind. My pulse quickened. I glanced around, searching for the nearest door, calculating how fast I could reach it. The hallway stretched longer than it had before. Or maybe that was just my fear, twisting reality. Seconds dragged. The silence felt alive, pressing against my skin. Then, finally, he moved. A slow, deliberate nod. No words, no expression. Just that single motion before he turned, shuffling toward his door. I let out a shaky breath. I had followed the rule. But as his door clicked shut behind him, a cold thought crawled into my mind. What would have happened if I hadn't? Well, shaking off that clingy feeling, I went to work. That evening, I returned from work, exhausted. The day had been long, but my mind had been longer. I had spent most of it replaying the morning, the old man's face, the weight of that silence. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just an old man. Just a weird set of rules. That was all. But when I reached my door, I stopped. A plate of food sat neatly on the floor. A bowl of soup and a slice of bread. My stomach twisted, hunger gnawing at me after skipping breakfast and barely touching lunch. My first thought was maybe Mrs. Carter left it. Maybe it was some sort of welcome gesture. And then my fingers curled into fists as I repeated the rule number 4 in my head. Do not eat food left outside your door. No one in this house leaves food for others. I swallowed hard. The hallway was empty. I bent down, hesitating before picking up the plate. The ceramic was cool, the silver lid covering the bowl gleaming under the dim hallway light. The smell of something familiar, something faintly metallic, drifted up. My unease deepened. I carried the plate to the kitchen, every step heavier than the last. I wasn't going to eat it, obviously, but I needed to see what was inside. With a slow breath, I lifted the lid. The stench hit me instantly. Rotting meat. Foul. Wet. Wrong. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't soup. It was something thick, dark, clotted and strange, pulsing lumps. Something moved beneath the surface, shifting sluggishly like it was alive but struggling to stay that way. I gagged, my hands trembling as I hurled the plate into the trash, the bowl shattering against the inside of the bin. The stench lingered, curling into my nostrils, clinging to the back of my throat. I turned, to leave. And then, I saw him. The old man from room 7. Standing in the hallway. Watching me. His face was blank, unreadable. His dark eyes never blinked. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded once. And walked away. That night, I lay in bed, every muscle in my body was tense. I had locked the door. I had checked it twice. I had pulled the blanket up to my chin like it could protect me from whatever lurked beyond these walls. But none of that mattered. Not really. Because something was wrong in this house. And then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., I heard it. A soft humming, drifting through the hallway like a lullaby meant for something else. My stomach twisted. I knew that tune. I had heard it earlier that day. Mrs. Carter, humming to herself as she wiped the counter, her voice light and distant. It had seemed harmless then. But now, it feels different. The sound grew clearer, threading its way through the thin walls, curling into the cracks of my room like smoke. It was calm, slow, too slow, like someone drawing out each note deliberately. And, the 6th rule says, if you hear the landlady humming past midnight, do not look out of your window. Do not let her know you are awake. I gripped my blanket, my pulse hammering in my ears. Don't look. Don't move. The humming grew louder and closer. And then, footsteps. Soft, measured, dragging lightly across the wooden floor outside my room. Each step deliberate, stretching out the distance between them, like whoever was walking was listening for something. They stopped. Right outside my door. My breath caught in my throat. The door. Locked. It was locked. But the footsteps didn't leave. And then, the doorknob rattled. A slow, testing turn. Once. Twice. My entire body locked up. I clenched my eyes shut, forcing myself not to move, not to breathe too loud, not to exist in that moment. Maybe if I stayed still enough, she would go away. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The air in the room felt suffocating. Thick with something unseen. For a long, agonizing moment. Silence. And then, A whisper. Soft. Right outside the door. I know you're awake. A cold shiver crawled down my spine, sinking deep into my bones. I didn't react. I didn't move. I couldn't. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, finally, footsteps again. Moving away. Slow. Measured. The humming started up once more, fading, drifting down the hallway, melting into the night. I lay there, frozen, staring into the darkness until morning. By the next evening, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I couldn't stay in this house, not after last night, not after the rules kept proving themselves real. I shoved my clothes into my bag, my hands shaking, my mind screaming at me to hurry. Just get out. Don't look back. Don't question it. Just leave. But as I stepped into the hallway, a cold wave of dread washed over me. I froze. At the far end of the hall, the old man from room 7 stood perfectly still. His frail frame seemed smaller in the dim light, his hollow eyes locked onto me. Waiting. Watching. I swallowed hard. Greet him. Say something. Good evening, I forced out, my voice tight. Silence. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't greet me back. My stomach twisted violently. If he doesn't greet you back, hide in the nearest room immediately. I turned, heart hammering, scanning for an open door. Any door. But before I could move, the hallway lights flickered. A deep, wet breathing sound slithered through the air, thick and unnatural, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then, something shifted in the shadows. The space at the end of the hall stretched as if the walls were bending, pulling apart. Something was there. Something big. Something wrong. The nearest door creaked open. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I dove inside and slammed the door shut behind me. From outside, a dragging sound came. Slow. Heavy. Scraping against the floor. Something was moving down the hallway. And then, knock, knock. I squeezed my eyes shut. No. Not again. A voice, muffled through the door. Hey, man, it's Adam. My key isn't working. Can you open up? I clamped a hand over my mouth. Not real. It's not real. The knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock. My breath hitched in my throat, every muscle in my body screaming. Stay silent. Then, a pause. A whisper. Right against the door. I know you're awake. The lights in the room flickered. And then, the door handle started to turn. The handle twisted. The door swung open. And something unseen, something cold, something hungry, grabbed me. The air rushed out of my lungs as an invisible force dragged me forward. The walls twisted, stretched, swallowed me whole. Darkness. Pressure. Like I had fallen into something deep. Something endless, something that didn't want to let go. I tried to scream. But there was no sound. No air. No me. I don't remember what happened after that. But when I woke up in the morning, my room was still there. My bags still packed. The bed untouched. But I was gone. Outside room 7, a fresh piece of paper was taped to the wall. The rules, unchanged. Except for one. A new line, written in dark, uneven letters, pressed deep into the page. If you hear someone knocking and claiming to be the new tenant, ignore them. They are not real.